So good noon, Sanjeev and everyone. Very, very happy to have Sanjeev on our panel. We're going to discuss variety of things, but let me introduce first who Sanjeev is from a cover of his own book. And, I was telling Sanjeev just a minute ago that I'm absolutely surprised how he's able to sort of make dent in so many areas. So let me introduce him. His book says an internationally acclaimed economist, urban theorist, and a best-selling author. He writes on wide array of topics ranging from economics to history. And in 2014, he was given an inaugural International Indian Achievers Award for contribution to literature. He has been a fellow of Royal Geographical Society, London, visiting scholar at Oxford University, adjunct fellow at Institute of Policy Studies, and senior fellow of Worldwide Fund for Nature. And this book I sort of read in 2016. And after that, Sanjeev must have added many other dimensions. But for us, most importantly, he's a policy maker and a principal economic advisor to the government. So welcome, Sanjeev. Yeah. Okay, let's start from sort of a very big picture, Sanjeev, in terms of what you're thinking of us as a country and the way forward. I'm reading your book, Indian Renaissance, where, of course, you list the reasons why India has been performance has been underwhelming, and now things could look better. I mean, you sort of want to give us a big picture sense of how you see India evolving over next many years.
So let me begin by thanking you and of course everybody on the call for giving me the opportunity to come and speak to all of you. So I look forward to this freewheeling conversation with Maneesh, and of course I'm sure there'll be questions from all of you. So the first question is a very wide one, and I am assuming you're not speaking here about the current, specifically about the current situation, which is, of course, we will, I'm sure, come to. See, the most important thing to think about history, and I'm going to speak here first as a historian, since you introduced me as a historian, is to understand that, look, most of history is not about periods of steady growth. It's mostly about short periods of burst by historical standards. When I mean by bursts by historical standards, I'm talking a few decades when countries basically go through a shift and upgrade themselves, so to speak. China went through that phase in the last 25, 30 years. Japan went through it in two phases. One is after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, and then after the rebuilding during the post-Second World War. Britain went through this phase first partly in the 18th century, and then through a massive expansion in the second half of the 19th century. So, the question, therefore, that I was trying to raise in that book that you mentioned, which was incidentally my first book written about 15 years ago, was when will we go through a rebirth? Will we ever have an opportunity to do that? And my point that I wanted to make was that every country that goes through this renaissance is very often goes through this in a short period. And during that period, it has a phase, sort of the spirit of the times is about risk taking. And everybody takes risk in every field of human endeavor. So let me talk about, say, the European, 5 centuries of European domination starts essentially with, the 15th century. Starting with northern Italy, then it spreads to northern Europe. And what does it start with? It starts with Venice and Florence. Now, today we think of Venice and Florence as places of artistic innovation. But in fact, artistic innovation was actually a side effect. What they were really there for was commercial innovation. Florence was a financial center. Much of modern finance was invented there, including the double entry bookkeeping system. Venice was similarly a commercial center. Equity markets, since many of you are from equity markets, the modern equity markets was invented in Venice. And of course, then it spread to the Netherlands, and ultimately, of course, finding its culmination in Britain. So, what is interesting is that every stage, these characters who were doing these innovations in the arts, for example, were very much in touch with the people who were doing the commercial innovations or the scientific innovations. I mean, Galileo was living at the same time as Michelangelo, roughly speaking. Mm-hmm. And Leonardo da Vinci was first and foremost an engineer. That was what his real job was. He also was an artist, and he also did scientific stuff. So the point I'm making is a moment comes in a history of a place where this all begins to happen very quickly and all together, and there's a culture of risk-taking. So Britain's domination of the seas and of the world starts with Elizabethan Britain. But Elizabethan Britain created, of course, Francis Drake, who was, by the way, a pirate, quite apart from being an explorer and so on. But it was also the same court that had Shakespeare and Marlowe. So what I'm trying to say is that kind of thing happens. Now, a very short example of that happened in late 19th century and early 20th century Bengal. Mm-hmm. And for a short period, Bengal produced every kind of brilliance. It created brilliant social reformers, but it also created brilliant literature. It also created great scientists, political leaders, and interestingly, also great businessmen. People do not remember Bengalis as being businessmen, but late 19th century, early 20th century, Bengal was full of entrepreneurs doing incredible things. Some of the great pharmaceutical companies of India were created by Bengalis. Some of them are still around, but not in great shape, maybe as they used to be. Dwarkanath Tagore is remembered for, of course, being the patriarch of the Tagore family and patronage to arts and so on. But actually, he was a drug runner. He made most of his money through opium, which, by the way, is how most of the Parsi families also made their money. But anyway, point I'm making to is an attitude of risk-taking happens at a certain point in history. Now, the question is, can we have a few decades of that happening here as well? Mm-hmm. And what will trigger that? Very often, by the way, these things are triggered by periods of extreme stress, quite interestingly. So, for example, Bengal's Renaissance happened again in the 19th century against the extreme stress of course, having been conquered by the British. They were the first people to be conquered by the British. And then a series of very devastating famines that hit Bengal. And of course, there was the fear of missionaries and so on. And as a result of which, Bengal went through that Renaissance, which was a response, in a sense, to the stress they were feeling at that time. Elizabethan Britain, for example, went through enormous stress because they were under threat from Catholic Spain. And much of that happened under actually a period of extreme stress. 19th century Britain went through enormous, Renaissance. Much of modern world was created by 19th century Britain, but it happened under the backdrop of loss in the Americas, and then followed by the extreme stress of the Napoleonic Wars. So what I'm trying to say is extremely stressful periods basically throw away the sort of mental cobwebs of a people. And that is the context in which they go through these. And by the way, this happened to the Chinese as well. Yes. The Chinese went through extreme stress in the 20th century. I mean, if you read 20th century, early 20th century Chinese history, it's horrific. They got repeatedly humiliated by the European powers. Then the Japanese conquered them. Then they had a very bloody domestic civil war, followed by the horrors of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. And it's only really in 1980, that's not so long ago, well within our lifetimes, that China really began to come together and came out of that period of stress and really took off. So I personally think that we need to go through maybe some catharsis, maybe the stress of this particular episode will be what will sort of wake us up. But ultimately, the ultimate outcome of that has to be a culture of risk-taking in every sphere of activity, whether it's in terms of literature, science, economic activity, financial markets, wherever it is, we need to get, and policymakers too. We can't have conservative policy making all the time, fearful of things going wrong, and not be willing to take changes. And I think we are in, at least in this space, I can say the Prime Minister Modi has really changed the culture of things. I mean, some of the things he does have been truly path-breaking, and whether like or dislike demonetization or GST or many of the other changes that are happening right now with the administrative reforms, these are path-breaking reforms. The agriculture reforms we are right now doing, these are path-breaking reforms. The same attitude, by the way, is exactly the same attitude that is being applied at our border in Ladakh. The same risk-taking behavior. Now, this is not random risk-taking and doing, just without thinking, but thinking through things, but then ultimately the willingness to press the accelerator, the trigger, to do the thing. That is something that I think this government is willing to do. And of course, all change is painful. But if we do not as a society take those risks, then we never will get on with it.
But I want to ask you again, if the condition precedent for growth, Sanjeev, is risk-taking, then who will induce risk-taking in society? Because as we speak right now, the environment that we live in is that everyone appears risk-averse. Many, many billionaires have lost whatever they sort of made over, tens of years. Enterprises are busted right now. There is very little risk-taking, if you come to Bombay. Okay.
I agree with you. So that is precisely why I raised this issue. That this is where the mettle of a society, eventually, the politicians, the policymakers, the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the artists, everybody is drawn from that same society. It's just by pure chance that some of us end up doing one thing and not the other. I mean, some exam we took and how well we did at age 22 very often determines what we ended up doing. So we are not fundamentally different. And most of the people on this call will not be fundamentally different from each other or from people if you ended up visiting a university or if you came to North Block and met me. You're all the same people. So the thing that ultimately drives it is ultimately the spirit of the times. That's why I keep coming back to this. How a society takes a shock and deals with it. So, for example, the shock of this, the destruction from the Second World War happened to the Germans and the Japanese as well. And they rebuilt themselves. Now, other societies may have fallen apart under the same circumstances. The same shock to North Korea and South Korea, same country, they took the shock of this Korean War and they responded to it in two different ways. So I think there is something to be said about the spirit of the times, and I would strongly say that given the stress we are going through right now, how we respond to it as a society, ultimately the political leadership is also going to respond to it as a society, because it'll respond to the incentives of the political incentives it faces. And so will the policymakers, so will everybody. So it is really a feedback system where we are all feeding on each other. So it ultimately depends heavily on the response we do as a civilization, as a country, as a society to this situation. That will mark out the men from the boys.
So, but as a society and more importantly as government, and this is the last question on a very long range one, do we really celebrate risk-taking? Do we celebrate markets? Because, when I look at our Anglo-Saxon peers, Trump often celebrates the S&P 500's peak. And, Powell often talks about that, we have to ensure that the COVID-19 should not mean any company goes bankrupt because of COVID-19. I don't hear those voices from the government in India.
Well, let me say it. We absolutely do not want a single company, big or small, to go bankrupt as a result of this. And we have, by the way, put an enormous effort to this. So now that we are speaking a little more shorter term, I mean, there is a lot of thought that has gone into our effort, therefore, to providing that 100% backstop guarantee from the government to SME, incremental SME lending. That is the thought behind, for example, this one-time window that is being given for a reset for bank loans. So we definitely see it that way. If the message wasn't coming out loud and clear, well, here it is.
Okay. No, I hear it. Do you want to explain to us in terms of, you've sort of many calls that I've attended of yours, you've talked of this, uh, you call it barbell strategy. You've sort of talked of hedge, that you started with full lockdown because you didn't know what this COVID-19 virus was and then opening up. Now, this is, I would say, is quite different from many other countries. And not just in US and other developed countries, but also South Asia. Now, I want to ask you this, that as of right now, it appears that the economic outcome of this strategy appears inferior to what other countries have been able to achieve. Now, how do we ensure that this does not inflict more pain on us relative to others in longer term?
So I'll tell you what the strategy is. You already sort of named it. So, and many of the people on the call will recognize it instantaneously. I think even 6 months later, this was a sensible strategy. And if faced with a similar situation, we will do it again. So let me explain what it is. And I think in the longer run, it will turn out to be a sensible strategy. So let me explain it. So let us go back to the middle of March. And what is the information that I had to take decisions based on? Basically, it was that something very bad had happened in China. We didn't know exactly what had happened, but it seemed to have killed a lot of people. But we didn't have very clear information what had actually happened. In fact, by the way, it's still not very clear what had happened in China. We knew that it had spread to northern Italy, that it had killed a lot of people and was killing a lot of people, and that it seemed to be spreading to other places, including India. That was the sum total of what information we had. We didn't know exactly any of the characteristics of this new disease. So we, of course, like everybody else, called in all the experts, and they gave us a very wide range of things that could happen. So there were people who said, no, don't worry about it. This is a bad flu, that's all. All you need to do is to go for herd immunity and so on. And then there was the other extreme, and you will remember them on television as well, saying that by July, hundreds of millions of people will have this disease, and literally you will have 2-3 million people dead. Now, the one thing we understood out of this is that nobody had a clue. That when you have such a wide range of outcomes possible from experts, that means basically nobody knows. So how do you respond to this? Now, this is not a unique problem. Other countries also faced it. So they responded in different ways. The UK, for example, initially went for herd immunity, then it changed their mind about it. Singapore, by the way, also went for a light touch, then went for a heavier touch. Sweden went for a particular approach, and they're stuck by it, to give them credit. But we realized that whatever it is we did, we would have to stick with it through the thing, because you can't change direction for 1.3 billion people. So what could we do that we didn't have to change direction for 1.3 billion people? Now, the only strategy that seemed sensible was a barbell strategy, which is used in finance, which is basically you don't take the median approach, the median response, but you take the two opposite responses. So you hedge for the very worst outcome, and then on the other side, you take some risks on a feedback loop basis. This is basically what we have done. We hedged for the very worst outcome. I mean, it could have been that the very worst outcome was going to happen, that literally millions of people were dying on the streets. So given that was a possibility, we went for a full lockdown. for about the first month or so, if you'll remember, starting around about the end of March and through much of April. Now, it is not the case that we were sure that what was going on. It's just that we're hedging for the very worst. And then that gave us time to put in some quarantining facilities, put in some testing ability. It requires time to not only buy the kits, but to train people, get it out there, get people to actually take masks and all these kinds of things seriously. All of this happened during that phase. Then by this time, we had also better information from the experience of other countries who were further up the time scale. And based on that, we have been easing things. So now we have kept easing. Now, basically, we have reached the stage where we have removed all nation-level restrictions except for large-scale travel. Other than that, we have removed all restrictions. There are now still localized restrictions, and they will probably be there going up. But even there, we have basically from the central level left it almost entirely at the local level, which is the right thing to do. Now, question will be asked is, why are you willing to open up now when we were willing to do a shutdown then? Well, very simple reason. Because we have better information now. So we can make some trade-offs. I could not have made any sensible trade-offs then, because it is entirely possible that things could have gone completely belly up. So those who were going for, say, completely laissez-faire approach, maybe have been the guys who had got blown up by then. So we took this particular approach. If given the set of information that we had, then we are faced with another situation, I don't think anybody will argue that what we did would be an unreasonable response, given our circumstances and the scale of the thing. Now, the question is, what do we do going forward? Well, we have found out that this disease is not as deadly as the worst case. It is still pretty infectious. And certainly for certain demographics, it's pretty deadly. But we can more or less manage it. By the way, I have myself had COVID. And my whole family has had COVID. And we have managed it. We are not entirely out of the danger zone yet. But we seem to have gotten away with relatively mild, basically nothing much more than a bad persistent flu. So, maybe for most people, that is what will happen. We have also, by the way, thanks to this, we have much better information about oximeters and oxygen levels, etc. So we are able to now manage it. So I think we will, vaccine or no vaccine, we will be able to basically open things up to a large extent over the next few months. So that is, one thing is clear, we have taken our foot off the brake. Now, this is the same approach we have taken on the economy. Mm-hmm. People have told us that, look, you should have gone and had this $1 trillion thing right in the beginning. But our view on this, and I made this right in the beginning, I said this, so it should come as no surprise that I'm sort of making this up 6 months down the line. Right in April, I said this, and many of you were on the call, that look, we are not looking at this as reflation. This is a safety net approach in the same spirit as the barbell strategy. We were basically creating a safety net, a cushion for the economy. We were not reflating it. We were basically, our view was, look, the very poorest people make sure they have food. They have some money in their bank account. Same thing is true, for make sure that there is no cascading defaults, particularly for SMEs. So hence the concept of providing the moratorium, pushing back financial deadlines, and so on. All of that is cushioning. It is not reflation. Because our view was there was no point in doing a reflation when you had your foot firmly on the brake. And I think you will discover this with other countries as well, where they have run up massive debts at the government level to transfer monies to people, various COVID checks or whatever. And the finding so far is that while there is some benefit from it, most of this money has actually been saved. So you've used up your ammunition and got relatively little outcome out of it. Now, the GDP number will look better. But listen, you've used up all your ammunition, so of course, you can't now fire any more bullets. We, on the other hand, did not do this and held our fire. Now, this does not mean that we are unwilling to use our ammunition. But we will press the accelerator when we have taken the foot off the brake, which we have done now. The time now has come to press the accelerator. So now, since I told you that we were not pressing the accelerator all this while, so now do take it seriously when I say we are going to press the accelerator from here on. And we do have monetary space. I, of course, have been arguing that we have lots of monetary space for a long time. By the way, even before COVID, I have been a votary of this. I do not think, whatever the headline CPI number may say, that there is any demand-driven inflation in our system. In fact, whatever inflation is happening because of the lockdown-driven disruptions. The gap between the WPI and the CPI is very clearly indicative of this. So I don't think any demand-driven inflation should be getting in the way. In any case, there is, as you know, a big debate about the quality of the CPI number itself, which overstates inflation. I mean, there is no way that there is real estate inflation in our economy. I mean, if anything, it's a large negative number. So the fact of the matter is there is no constraint on inflation. There is also no external constraint on monetary policy. We have an exchange rate that is trying very hard to appreciate as we speak. And we are accumulating reserves as a result of that. There is also no problem with the current account. So macroeconomically speaking, there is no real constraint on pushing for growth. The real constraint on the economy, or the problem with the economy is growth. And so we need to go for growth. And I'm very, very clear about the fact, as far as, let me be absolutely clear, that there is no reason we should hold back macroeconomically from growth. Now, we have talked about monetary policy. On the fiscal front as well, let me make it clear. Sure, we don't want to go overboard, and we are a fiscally conservative government, and I think we have more than exhibited that. But it is true that this is a good time as any, to use whatever fiscal space we have. Our debt to GDP ratio is not catastrophically high compared to most other countries. And I would say we have the space to increase our debt to GDP ratio. And if ever there was a moment to do it, this has got to be it. So let me also make it clear that we will use our fiscal space. And the way we will use our fiscal space, also let me make it clear that while some transfers to the very poor is necessary, because they do need cushioning still, but a generic approach of reflating the economy through transfers is perhaps wasteful, because much of that will be simply saved and you will not get the second and third order demand effects from it. So it's much more sensible for the government to directly spend this money on whatever it needs to do. And there are a whole bunch of things we do need to spend on. Infrastructure being one big area where we need to spend. So we need to spend on infrastructure. There are lots of spade-ready projects, including, for example, the new Delhi airport. And we need to spend on that and get on with it.
So on the fiscal deficit, again, I want to sort of ask you that what are the binding constraints in terms of, I mean, our nominal GDP growth is likely to be, of course, much higher than the rates that we have in India. And so therefore, I mean, for 30 years, I've been reading that, this level of debt in US or Japan is catastrophic and eventually the country will collapse, but not happen. In a sense, what is our binding constraint? I can understand from a market standpoint, it appears to me that binding constraint is that you cannot load a lot of bond supply on the markets, because what happens, of course, is that, the bond spreads start to widen, and then the efficacy of monetary policy then it starts to get sort of diminished. So in your view, what are the binding constraints? And then how do you deal with this market's inability to absorb the kind of supply that you...
So obviously, we do not want to overdo things in a way that begins to affect our ability to finance ourselves. So of course, we will watch very carefully what our ability to finance is. But let me, in this context, also say a few things. First of all, there are no macroeconomic constraints to it. So if we do push the accelerator, it's not like our current account will suddenly go into a large deficit, the rupee will begin to depreciate. All those constraints are not there. Secondly, this happens to be a time where we are likely to see for a prolonged period, at least for 24 months, cheap global capital. I think the Fed has been very clear that capital will be cheap for a prolonged period of time. Even internally, I would say that while the 10-year benchmark has not gone down as many of us would like it to, below that, interest rates are quite low. I mean, a 1 year money can be raised at 3.5% now, and it's not so bad. Things are slowly, the transmission is happening. It is not, as I said, as fast as many of us would like it. It will happen. And as far as squeamishness about monetization is concerned, let me say that reasonable amounts of monetization is something that we are willing to do. But it will have to be done in a balanced sort of way, taking various constraints into account. So simply pressing the accelerator doesn't mean that you just slam it in and not care about where this is going. So it will be done. We are a conservative government. And so our conservatism continues to be there. But we do see the fact that, we have saved the ammo for a point in time. Then there's no point in not firing the ammo at the right time, and the right time has arrived.
And a last point on the near-term situation is, I mean, you talked about, I think last week I heard you talking of hysteresis, and are you really worried right now? Is government in general worried that the current setting can become a new status quo for us?
Absolutely. So hysteresis happens for many reasons. Some of them are just purely psychological, yes. And that's why I started with this whole idea about how we deal with this as a society matters. So I think this is very important that we do not lose our sense of risk-taking in this, sort of going into this spiral downwards. But there are real things that can also happen. And one of the places where hysteresis tends to show up is actually in the financial system, by virtue of the fact that you get tied up in knots by NPAs and so on. And there, it doesn't matter what your great spirit of risk-taking is. If the banking system can't go out and take risk, it can't. So this is the context in which we are very, very serious about not letting a cascade of default jam up the banking system. And so this is why I am, watching very, very carefully what happens to this one-time window that we have provided to the banking system to recalibrate the NPAs. We will provide every support to the banks to do a one-time reset. If there are corporates here who are on the call, please take this seriously. We will provide you every support needed to do this. The banks are on board on this. They recognize the importance, to their balance sheet, but also to the wider economy. Because at the end of this process, we need a banking system that is able to go out there and expand again. India's banking system is just too small relative to its economy. It needs to be an order of magnitude larger. I'm not talking, so don't think in 10, 20% growth. You've got to think of an order of magnitude larger. And it needs to be healthy to be able to do that and take risk. Now, this is not to create opportunity to allow the bad behavior of the past to be sort of perpetuated. We have to be careful with doing that as well. So there is a moral hazard issue that we do not want to perpetuate. And that is why we did put a cutoff that, stuff that happened before the COVID is not going to be kind of used to forgive for this. But things that happen post-COVID will indeed be taken care of. And we continue to take the insolvency and bankruptcy issue very seriously. Now, here, I know many people will come and talk about the bad bank. So let me give a few words here about the bad bank. Obviously, I'm speaking here from my personal view. This is not the government's view. This is a matter that is still under debate. But let me tell you, my view on this is that a bad bank is a bad idea. The reason for that is the following. That a bad bank is likely to create a BIFR type warehouse where a lot of this stuff will be dumped and will fester there for years. Everybody talks about the bad banks that have done the rest of the world. Well, I happen to have been the chief economist for Deutsche Bank during the phase immediately after the Asian crisis. And my experience was that whether it's Indonesia or Malaysia, so Ibra or Danahata and all those were not particularly successful. I am of the view that it's much easier to do, if you're going to do a restructuring, it's better to do it in situ, in the banks, where they actually know those assets best. What you need to do is to encourage the banks and create windows for them to do it quickly, in situ. It will take a lot of time in India to create a new institution, transfer it there, then there'll be information loss. And of course, nobody will be responsible for those assets and they'll just fester there. Those assets are valuable assets. We need to redeploy them fast as possible. So I am much more stronger advocate of this one-time window and longer term of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Strengthening it with better NCLT, fully there with you. And more resources should be put into the NCLT and more judges or whatever. But to, the amount of resources that will be needed to capitalize a bad bank, and then after all, a huge amount of resources will be needed to recapitalize the banks with, and immediately there'll be lots of prolonged and painful and largely pointless debates on what valuation they'll be transferred. All of those debates we will get into. So much, much better in situ, while they are still lying with the banks, which actually know something about those assets, to do it there fast. And let us get on with the business of expanding this economy again.
I mean, Sanjeev, every time I talk to you, I've told you this, that there's no reason not to be bullish on India is the way I think. But then, when you actually look at execution of a lot of things that you are talking to me about, and, you actually, as the government has talked about, stuff like even MSME scheme, execution always remains a challenge. Somehow in the bureaucracy or within the banking, things do not get executed, and which is perhaps the reason why even after 6 months, our credit continues to sort of slow down. Whereas look at China and many other countries, M3 is soaring everywhere. And of course, credit is starting to inflate pretty much in many other places in the world. How do we treat this? How do we...
So I think, first of all, step one in this has got to be a quantitative expansion. That, by the way, is happening in India because it is not happening through monetization, but it's happening through accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. However, it does not matter. Money is money. If you look at the growth of reserve money in recent months, last 6 weeks in particular, you will see there's been a very significant acceleration. That's a very good sign. It will feed through with a few iterations into M3. So the quantitative conditions are falling in place. So really, it's now up to the financial sector to and here it's a partnership between us. It's not about bureaucracy or, we as a society have to dig ourselves out. It's not we, the government, telling you, the financial system, what to do. It's a partnership. Tell us if there are things. Ultimately, these write-offs will have to be done by you, not by us. So tell us what are the things you have to do and what are the rules you need changed. What are the sensible things that we need to do? We will put those rules in place. But, you and the financial sector have to also take the hit and carry on and get up, dust off the dirt from the hit you've had and get on with it. After all, look at the financial, since you talked about what happens globally, look at the Chinese banks and mutual funds are getting up there and taking risk. Look at what the American banks are doing, Citibank. All these guys went through a lot of things and they took a lot of hit in the last financial crisis in 2008, but they ultimately dusted it off and went and took risks again. Quite differently, for example, from the European banks, which remain jammed up to this day.
But, in US particularly, Sanjeev, there is a backstop. Even after 2008, even the banks that you talked about didn't get to 5% gross NPAs. Very generous terms were offered to them. Right now, our banking is stuck with, 10% NPA, likely to go to 14%. And here, Sanjeev telling us that take more risk.
Oh, well, you tell us what are the rules and regulations you actually need in order to do this. We'll change them for you. You tell us what you want changed. We have given you this window to do all these restructurings. If you think you need any other kind of window, tell us.
See,
I
finally,
don't think you will find policymakers getting in the way. At some level, you have to also take those risks. The bank boards have to get on them and, put their stamp to the risks.
so, I mean, okay, the crux of the matter, Sanjeev, is actually the income loss, because of COVID-19, last 6 months, no activity, EBITDA has fallen.
I agree. The income losses happened to us in the government as well, right? Our incomes from taxation have crashed. So it's not that just you are facing this; we are facing it as well. And you are asking us to take the risk, go out there, borrow, monetize, etc. And I'm telling you, we are willing to do it. Now let's see you do it.
I mean, I understand this point, but in the end, the government is essentially to balance it, Sanjeev. In a sense, when
We
hysteresis.
are willing to do it. We are telling you, we are backstopping you.
Okay.
But ultimately, we are not separate people. We are in it together. That's the point I'm trying to make throughout. As a society, we have to be willing to go out and do stuff. And to grant America this spirit. They take all kinds of risks. Many things go belly up. But they stand up and do it again. Mm-hmm. That is the why their society is robust. So at the end of it, governments respond only to what their society are a reflection of the societies that they are a part of. So we are saying we will do some part of it. Mm-hmm. But if, we have whether the corporates or the financial sector saying, if only the world was perfect, then we will take risk. Then, you are basically the public sector.
Mm-hmm. I get your point. No, I understand. So now, let's switch gear now to something, which you've talked about so many times, which is, building infra in India. Instead of, transferring money to people, you believe that, it's time that, we spend a lot of this to build infra, world-class infra. Now, you want to sort of talk about it in terms of what kind of infrastructure do we envisage that, will be built in India? Or is it going to be, again, roads and ports? Or it's going to be about the new tech infra, the 5G and such like, because that's where the real...
So a lot of infrastructure, we need infrastructure, everything. I mean, central governments need to build certain kinds of infrastructure. They tend to be of that ports kind of infrastructure because that's what we do. But a lot of the infrastructure that needs to be built in the country has to happen at the local government level. Our cities need infrastructure, our villages need infrastructure. Some of it we will do from our side. For example, some of it is social infrastructure. For example, one major form of infrastructure we have built across the country, oddly from a central government scheme, is toilets. We are now doing that with water. By the way, these have enormous social and health benefits in the long run. So that will only show up over time, but we are doing it. We're putting it in place. But we do need to begin to see state governments to stand up and begin to actually take our cities seriously and do these changes. Mumbai was and is building some very major infrastructure, by the way. After 100 years, we are actually building some completely new transportation system beneath your feet. I believe that construction, after a brief break, is now completely back on track. The coastal road also, I think, after all the judicial intervention, is now, I think, also getting built up. You can confirm this to me.
Yes.
So those things are getting built, at least in some of those places. I think the new airport needs to get up and running, and I hope and that again, the private sector needs to sort out amongst itself and get on and build it. I don't think there's anything from the government side that we have that is lacking, but if there is, please let us know. We will happy to sort those out as well. Again, delays that had happened on the new airport in Delhi. Those are now Zurich should be. Now time has come for Zurich to get on with it and build the airport. And we need it, by the way, in some shape and form by the second or third month of 2022, because we have the G20 host, and we need at least, while we may not need the terminal, we will need the tarmac for landing large numbers of jets of visiting heads of state. So we think, we need to get on with it and build this stuff. Now, there are areas where the government needs to get its act together. I know There have been historical problems with payments, for example, to contractors. We have worked very hard to smoothen that out. It's not fully done, but I think, and you can give us feedback on this, that payments to contractors have dramatically improved in the last 6 months. One of the things that may have improved during COVID. So I think, and there are, of course, defense-related things that have become much faster. We are now doing procurements much faster than before. Defense infrastructure in our border areas, a lot of it is getting built out at a very high speed, which had taken decades are now getting done in months.
Since you've been an urban theorist, you want to sort of give us a sense of how, especially after COVID, some of us, rather most of us, are working from home. Do you reimagine the way workspace and the urban landscape would look like? And thereby, my question is that, should government rethink the way they want to build infrastructure in the country?
I absolutely agree that we need to rethink our cities completely. Here again, I'm not speaking as principal economic advisor to the government, but as an urban theorist. There is a fundamental flaw in the way we think of our cities. And what we do is we start with this assumption, our existing cities are just too difficult to clean up, improve, etc. Let us therefore go and do this new layout. And this new layout is usually some box structure with straight roads. And we somehow have this great impression that because Le Corbusier told us to have straight roads, there's a good thing in Chandigarh, therefore this is a good way of building cities. Utter rubbish. Of all the successful cities that we have built in recent times, Chandigarh or Chandigarh type cities are not the way to go forward. Gurgaon, with all its problems, is a successful city. What we need to do is to manage Gurgaon well, not to build more Chandigarhs. And the moment I say this, a lot of Indians will say, no, this can't be true. This is ridiculous because most people have actually never visited Chandigarh and make this, or they visited for a few hours en route to Shimla. And the fact of the matter is, Chandigarh is actually not a city at all. It's a subsidy scheme for civil servants. And it's an extremely expensive city to run. It has not produced anything of economic, cultural, or scientific importance in its 60 years of existence. What it does is uses up huge amounts of land to produce nothing of value. And the best example of which city is more successful between Gurgaon and Chandigarh, let me point out this way. Imagine two kids. One has grown up in Chandigarh, one has grown up in Gurgaon. They are both 25 years old today. What do you think is the higher likelihood? The Gurgaon guy will move to Chandigarh or the Chandigarh guy will move to Gurgaon? 99% of the time, the Chandigarh kid will move to Gurgaon, which my view is proof that Gurgaon is the most successful city. The problem is that Gurgaon has all kinds of infrastructure problems, and those problems happen because of its success, that people are moving there. We therefore need to invest in Gurgaon's infrastructure and improve it. And by the way, wherever we have invested in it, it does a pretty good job. There are parts of Gurgaon where infrastructure is improved and it works perfectly well. It's the problem is in the other parts where the garbage clearance is not good, the interior, colony roads are falling apart. So improve those colony roads. It is not about trying to create another, layout with new roads. At the end of it, whoever can afford living in old Mumbai lives in old Mumbai. They don't move to Navi Mumbai. Right?
Yes.
So, therefore, what we need to do is to upgrade our existing cities. We need to redeploy older parts of the cities and upgrade them. That is what we need to do. And yes, newer parts of the city need to be built. But we stop having this view that is basically some, think of it as some PWD project for building, a grid and putting some boxes on it. We need to take our urban landscape more seriously. And when we do it, we need to build new urban infrastructure, including, by the way, pieces of urban art. We need to create new iconic buildings. How long are we going to, use Victoria Memorial and Victoria Terminus as being the iconic buildings of our cities? I mean, Queen Victoria ko bahut hum logon ne pooj liya. Ab we need to build new iconic buildings. Where are our new iconic buildings? And this is the context, by the way, why I'm in favor of building that Shivaji statue in the sea in Mumbai. Where are our iconic buildings? How long are we going to run on those old buildings built by, the British? We need to build new iconic buildings. So I think there is a case for investing in new iconic buildings, new urban spaces. This whole, socialist era, Corbusierian, so we need to build only buildings we should build are hospitals which are square and box-like, is utterly stupid way of thinking about our cities. We've got to be proud of our cities, build iconic buildings, create new urban spaces, where are new temples, for example? Where are our new, iconic stations? We need to build these new things. And again, it comes to, by the way, a certain spirit of risk-taking, which we need to have. We tend to have this view that everything we build has to be somehow, utilitarian and grey-looking, some Soviet-looking building. Why?
Yeah.
Why can't new government buildings be iconic? And this is, by the way, the context in which this conversation is happening on refreshing the Central Vista in Delhi.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is not, by the way, about tearing down, great buildings of the past. It's not at all the case. Mm-hmm. In fact, North Block and South Block are not being torn down. They've been converted into museums so that the Indian public can come and enjoy those buildings. Mm-hmm. They are extremely impractical as office buildings. I work in them. They're not great office buildings, but they are great buildings. Nobody is saying we're going to tear them down. We're just going to redeploy them to things that you can use. We should have cafes, restaurants, etc. happening in the middle of Delhi. Why do you want Babus to be working in North Block? You should be going and visiting those great buildings.
Mm. Okay, this is so the last part of our conversation, and if you can explain to us, this idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat, and I want to understand two parts to it. One is how is it different from the Make in India program? Two is that is it an idea of import substitution, which sort of utterly failed in India in the first 5, 6 decades after independence? So, I mean, would you want to then finally conclude for us as in terms of as an investor, and you are of course asking us to take risk, and we're happily taking all the risk. What is it for us that we should expect, from Indian economy? And would something like Atmanirbhar Bharat be successful? Would we be in Vietnam or Bangladesh here?
Yeah, so let me first clarify what Atmanirbhar Bharat is not. This is not a return to 1950 style import substitution. It is not. Explicitly so. The Prime Minister himself said this. This is not a withdrawal from the rest of the world. Far from it, we actually want to be an active part of the rest of the world and global supply chains. I think the Prime Minister himself said this. The second thing this is not is some sort of an idea of a sort of government-dependent economy with licensing and so on. So Atmanirbhar Bharat is not Sarkar Nirbhar Bharat. So yes, we will provide support where necessary to the private sector, and whether it's infrastructure, if necessary, we'll even provide you with some infant industry protection or whatever. Maybe even this PLI type incentive to create a cluster, whatever. We have no ideological baggage here. Whatever is necessary to be done to support Indian industry will be done. But we need to, however, leverage and create capacities at home. So let me illustrate it. There's no way I can explain this, but to illustrate it. For example, in defense, we have no problem with foreign companies coming here. We, in fact, want foreign companies to set up shop here. But we will provide, over time, incentive structures such that we will buy foreign designed equipment, but they have to be produced in India. Mm-hmm. Why? Because it creates capacities in India, it creates jobs in India, it creates learning in India. Mm-hmm. So we want to do this. So therefore, you will already see there are 100 items that we have already said we will buy as long as they're produced in India. We don't care who produces it, but it has to be produced in India, and there are a certain amount of indigenization has to happen in India. So this is the kind of Atmanirbhar Bharat. That is what we mean by creating capacities here. Defense is one example of this approach. We similarly want, for example, let's say about, let's say take something in the services sector, right? So the old approach was that we wanted services sector, our companies to do well, etc. But our approach was, and in every negotiation, we would say, it has to be, we have to go and negotiate H-1B visas. Every trade negotiation India did is about H-1B visa. That's where it all gets stuck. So why do we need H-1B visas? When I actually asked foreign companies why they want H-1B visas, nobody wanted them. Our own companies, our outsourcing guys, our software guys why do you need H-1B visas? After all, if we are able to work from home in the government, why you in the IT sector need to go to America? Why can't you just load it on the cloud? So when I began to question people on this, then they began to dig out and tell me, no, this regulation doesn't allow us to do this. That some EPABX regulation doesn't allow us to load things in the cloud. Now I said, why didn't you come and tell us all of this before? Why were you trying to say, no, we thought that these regulations cannot be changed. Therefore, we were preferring to negotiate for H-1B visas because our own we were so convinced our own regulations could not be changed. But we can be changed, and we are now going to do that. So a lot of telecom regulations relating to all this EPABX and all kinds of other things, restrictions which get in the way of us using the global cloud and consequently not allowing us to onshore various activities. After all, we want Atmanirbhar means we want to create those capacities here. So we want you to be able to sell those products there. So yes, we're happy to provide support to long-term business visas, visiting, whatever, to visit those countries. But we want those activities to happen in Mumbai, in Bangalore, in Gurgaon, in Kolkata, Guwahati, eventually. So that is a very different approach we have. I'm just trying to show you the change in mindset.
So do you think, over next decade, Sanjeev, we could potentially become a net exporter to the world instead of being a perennial importer that we've been since independence?
Absolutely, that is the plan. And demand compression, thanks to COVID, has already forced us to become like that.
That's not a good way.
But it may not last, I agree. But anyway, but the fact of the matter is, I think what I want to signal to you is that our mindset has changed about many of these things. And I have to give full credit to the Prime Minister personally for this. That he does not suffer fools when it comes to these kinds of, but hum log aise kaise karenge kind of attitude. He gets totally, no prisoners are taken if this is the sort of thing that any department, any regulator comes up said, but sir, this cannot be done because of rule number 32 subsection C, then I can assure you, then there is no sense of humor about this.
So I want to sort of sneak in another 2 minutes because I have 2 minutes. I want to understand your view because we discussed about the China response that we've had. So as a market participant, what should be the key takeaway of what has happened? Should I be worried of this? Should I reprice India risk because what's happening on China borders and so on and so forth?
So I think, that you will have to do yourself. As a policymaker, I can't. And obviously, these are complex systems which can go down many different paths. Mm-hmm. So I'm not in the forecasting business. You can judge that. But let me say that in the past, we would have allowed the other side to do the moves, and we would have said, oh, well, what can we do? We will push back, but only with the hope that maybe they will go back to the original status quo. Our attitudes to this has changed very, very substantially. Mm-hmm. That I hope, is loud and clear. Mm-hmm. That attitude, by the way, means that if chess is to be played, both sides will make moves. Mm-hmm. But that attitude, by the way, also flows through in our attitude about global supply chains and our willingness to work on them. If necessary, we will not just be passive players in this. And you may have seen that we have gone out there, spoken to large global companies, and wooed them actively to move them here. Now, that new attitude has not percolated to every single department of the government yet. But I will say many parts, we have found that many departments have changed, and many state governments have a totally different attitude to this. And their state governments, people usually do not associate with proactiveness, like the UP state government, have been very, very proactive. So I think you will find us being a lot more aggressive. And by the way, we are open to feedback. If you think that government departments are doing things, or there are rules, regulations, laws that require changing, please bring them to our notice, especially if you can give us an alternative which both serves the original purpose and solves your problem. Tell us exactly what it is, and we will give it a very good look.
Okay, so many thanks, Sanjeev. For everyone, Sanjeev actually has COVID right now. He hasn't had COVID. He has COVID, and yet he's sort of very, very thankful to you, Sanjeev, that you came live and discussed all these issues. He is an absolutely phenomenal writer, and I'm not saying it because, I've known him for 20 years. And this is a book that I do recommend. It's the best book, that he has written, at least to me, The Ocean of Churn. And if people want to build a perspective of what India is from the view of, how historically India has been versus, the Aryan theory and everything, I would recommend that people read this book. So thank you, Sanjeev, again, and wish you all the luck. Quickly recover so that we can have a good chat again.
Thank you so much.